3 people climbed through my fence to measure my grass. 6 weeks later, 2 of them were standing before a judge, and an entire luxury neighborhood was begging me to turn their water back on. If that sounds crazy, trust me, I would have laughed too if somebody told me that story a year ago. My name is Cole Harper. I'm 38 years old, born and raised outside Cedar Ridge, Texas, and I run the same cattle ranch my grandfather bought after coming home from World War II. My wife, Emily, was 6 months pregnant when all this happened, and if you'd asked me back then what worried me most, I would have said drought, feed prices, or maybe diesel costs. Turns out the thing that nearly tore our lives apart was a homeowners association that couldn't mind its own business. Now, our ranch sat on the edge of a development called Silver Creek Estates. They arrived about 8 years ago, bringing hundreds of expensive homes, golf carts, private lakes, tennis courts, and enough landscaping to make the entire place look like a magazine cover. Every blade of grass was trimmed to perfection. Every mailbox matched. Every flower bed looked professionally staged. It wasn't really my kind of place, but I never had a problem with them. Folks can live however they want. What started bothering me was how some of their board members seemed obsessed with our ranch. They'd drive by slowly. They'd stare. Every few months, we'd get complaints about dust from our cattle trucks or the smell after a rainstorm. One woman actually asked if we could move our cows farther away because they ruined the view from her back patio. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. The cows had been there decades before her patio existed. But little comments like that started piling up. Looking back now, I think some of those people genuinely believe the world should reshape itself around their neighborhood. Then came the Sunday morning that changed everything. It was just after 7. I was sitting on the porch drinking coffee while Emily slept inside. The sun was barely up. The cattle were quiet. Everything felt peaceful. Then I heard an engine. Not unusual out here, except the sound was coming from the wrong direction. I stood up and looked toward the south pasture. There was a utility cart bouncing across my property. Not near the fence. Not along the road. On my property. I grabbed my hat and started walking that way. As I got closer, I saw 3 people. 2 men and a woman. All wearing Silver Creek Estates board badges around their necks. One guy was holding a tablet. Another was operating a drone. The woman was taking photographs. They were standing in my pasture like they owned it. I yelled, "Can I help you?" The woman jumped. The guy with the drone didn't. He just looked annoyed that I'd interrupted him. "We're documenting a nuisance issue," he said. "A nuisance issue? On my ranch." I honestly thought he was joking. Then the woman pointed toward the native grass growing along the fence line. Several residents have complained about the appearance. I stared at her for a second because I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. "The appearance?" I asked. "It's grass." She folded her arms. "It's overgrown and negatively affects surrounding property values." I remember laughing. Not because it was funny, because it was so ridiculous my brain didn't know what else to do. "Ma'am," I said, "my family owned this land before your entire neighborhood existed." That should have ended the conversation. It didn't. The guy with the tablet walked over and attached a laminated notice directly onto my fence. Then all 3 climbed back into their cart and drove away without another word. The second they were gone, I walked over to look at the notice. It was some nonsense about agricultural neglect and community impact. Basically a threat disguised as paperwork. That's when I noticed something else. The fence wire beside the gate had been cut. Clean cut. Not broken. Not damaged by weather. Cut. Somebody had taken bolt cutters to it. They didn't accidentally wander onto my property. They deliberately entered it. My stomach dropped. Suddenly, this wasn't some petty HOA complaint anymore. This was trespassing. I took photos immediately. Then I headed back toward the house. When I walked inside, Emily was awake. She'd heard the noise outside and seen strangers near the property through the bedroom window. Her hands were shaking. "Who were those people?" she asked. I tried calming her down, telling her everything was fine, but I could see the fear in her face. We had been trying for years to have a baby. Years. Miscarriages. Doctor visits. Heartbreak. This pregnancy felt like a miracle. Anything that threatened it terrified her. By early afternoon, she complained about dizziness, then a headache. By evening, I was driving her to the emergency room. The doctor checked her blood pressure twice because he couldn't believe the first reading. It was dangerously high. They ran tests. More tests. Then he pulled me aside. I'll never forget that conversation. He told me stress was contributing to a serious complication and that Emily needed immediate rest and monitoring. He wasn't making guesses. He documented everything. Every symptom. Every concern. Every trigger. I sat beside her hospital bed that night, listening to machines beep while anger slowly replaced fear. Those HOA board members had shown up worried about grass. My wife and unborn daughter were now sitting in a hospital because they decided property lines were optional. Around midnight, Emily finally fell asleep. I stepped outside into the parking lot and just sat in my truck staring into the darkness. That's when a memory floated back into my head. Something my father had mentioned years earlier about a utility agreement tied to Silver Creek Estates. At the time, I'd never paid much attention to it. But sitting there in that hospital parking lot, I suddenly realized there was a good chance those board members had no idea how much their neighborhood depended on my family. And before sunrise the next morning, I was about to find out exactly how much. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily lying in that hospital bed and those 3 HOA board members standing in my pasture acting like they owned the place. Around 5 in the morning, I left the hospital for a couple of hours and drove back to the ranch. The sun was just beginning to come up, casting that orange Texas glow across the fields. Normally, that view settles me down. That morning, it only sharpened my focus. My father always said that when somebody shows you exactly who they are, believe them the first time. Silver Creek's board had shown me who they were. The question was what I was going to do about it. I headed straight for the old records room inside our equipment barn. Most people would call it junk. To me, it was family history. Decades of contracts, surveys, maps, handwritten notes, utility agreements, water permits, and property records stacked in filing cabinets that dated back longer than I had been alive. My grandfather never threw anything away. Neither did my father. For years, I thought they were pack rats. That morning, they looked like geniuses. I spent nearly 2 hours digging through boxes before I found a file labeled Silver Creek Development Infrastructure Agreement. I opened it and immediately remembered my father talking about it years ago. Back when the subdivision was first being built, the developers had a problem. They needed a reliable water source during construction and while parts of their permanent system were being completed. The closest solution happened to be sitting beneath our ranch. My grandfather had drilled into a deep artesian aquifer decades earlier, and the well produced more water than our operation could ever use. The developers approached my father with an offer. Temporary access, limited usage, fixed compensation. At the time, it seemed harmless. Dad signed. Construction moved forward. Everybody got what they wanted. At least that's what everyone thought. Then I kept reading. Halfway through the agreement, I found a clause I vaguely remembered. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't complicated. It was actually written in plain English. The property owner retained the right to terminate access in the event of disputes, interference, property violations, or actions deemed harmful to the owner's interests. I read it 3 times, then a 4th. Then I sat there staring at the page. The entire development was still connected through infrastructure crossing our land. Their permanent upgrades had never fully replaced the original system. Somehow the arrangement remained active all these years. I grabbed a set of maps and headed to the pump station. Sure enough, every major control valve sat inside a locked structure on our property. Legally ours, maintained by us, powered through equipment registered to us. I stood there for a long minute, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. These people had spent years treating us like some outdated inconvenience, sitting next door to their luxury community. Meanwhile, the water keeping their golf course green and their decorative lakes full still flowed through equipment my grandfather installed. Before making any decisions, I called our attorney, Mike Callahan. Mike had represented our family for years and knew every inch of the situation. I explained everything: the trespassing, the damaged fence, Emily's hospitalization, the contract. Then I asked the question directly. Can I terminate it? There was silence for a moment. Papers shuffled. Then Mike said, Cole, based on what you've told me and what I'm reading, yes. But if you're going to do it, document everything and do it correctly. That's all I needed to hear. By noon, the termination notice was drafted, reviewed, and delivered. Every legal requirement satisfied. Every step documented. Every signature witnessed. Then I walked into the control building. There wasn't any dramatic movie music playing. No big speech. Just me standing in a dusty concrete room, looking at a set of valves that hadn't received much attention in years. I turned the first one, then the second, then the third. After that, I shut down the auxiliary system, secured everything with new locks, and walked away. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes to change the next 6 weeks of everyone's lives. That afternoon, I returned to the sheriff's office carrying photographs, copies of the damaged fence, drone images, timestamps, medical records, and statements from neighbors who had witnessed board members entering our property before. The deputy handling the case surprised me. He didn't brush it off. He didn't call it a civil matter. He listened carefully. By the end of the meeting, he looked genuinely concerned, especially after reviewing the hospital documentation connected to Emily's condition. Over the next 48 hours, investigators moved far faster than I expected. Apparently, cutting someone's fence and entering private property while creating circumstances linked to documented medical harm tends to get attention. While law enforcement handled their side, something else was unfolding over at Silver Creek. The first signs appeared on day 2. One of our ranch hands came into the barn smiling. You should see their golf course. I drove past later that afternoon. Sure enough, bright green fairways already showed patches of brown. Not huge ones, just enough to notice. Day 3 was worse. Decorative fountains stopped running. Water levels dropped. Landscaping crews were suddenly everywhere. Residents started posting online. Rumors spread faster than weeds. Some claimed there was a drought emergency. Others blamed equipment failures. A few suspected the board was hiding something. The truth was much simpler. Water had stopped flowing. By day 4, I received the first phone call. It came from a board member I had never met. His tone was polite. Very polite. Funny how quickly people discover manners when they need something. He asked if there had been a misunderstanding. I told him there wasn't. Then I explained the contract had been terminated following documented property violations. Silence. Then came the inevitable question. What would it take to resolve this? I told him we could discuss that after their trespassing issue was addressed. He didn't sound happy. 2 hours later, another board member called. Then another. By the end of the week, they were practically taking turns. Meanwhile, Emily had finally returned home. Her condition was improving. The stress levels were dropping. We spent quiet evenings sitting on the porch watching sunsets. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt something close to peace. Unfortunately, Silver Creek was just getting started. The following Monday, 5 board members arrived at my ranch unannounced. They came in expensive SUVs instead of golf carts this time. Amazing how different people act when they're asking instead of demanding. I met them outside near the barn. Nobody smiled. Nobody offered small talk. The president, a man named Richard Vance, stepped forward first. He was the same guy who had been operating the drone in my pasture. We need to find a solution, he said. I nodded. You should have thought about that before cutting my fence. His jaw tightened. Let's be reasonable. I actually laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. Reasonable, I said. You trespassed on private property, threatened me, frightened my pregnant wife, and ignored every boundary that existed. One of the others interrupted. Nobody intended harm. Intent doesn't change consequences, I replied. That shut him up. Then I handed them a folder. Inside was a proposal. Reconnection fees, water service rates, property damage compensation, medical reimbursement demands, long-term contractual protections. Every number had supporting documentation. Every condition had legal justification. Richard flipped through the pages and suddenly scoffed. This is ridiculous. I looked him straight in the eye. You think that's ridiculous? Then I handed him another folder. This one contained copies of the criminal investigation documents. Not rumors. Not threats. Actual findings. The color drained from his face almost immediately. The others started reading. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, one board member whispered, "This is serious." I've been serious from the beginning, I said. The meeting ended very differently than it started. Nobody threatened me. Nobody talked about property values. Nobody mentioned grass. They quietly gathered their paperwork and left. As their vehicles disappeared down the road, I stood there thinking maybe the lesson had finally landed. I was wrong, because while the board was panicking behind closed doors, investigators were preparing to make their next move, and what happened the following week would send shockwave through the entire community. The next week started with a phone call I won't forget. I was repairing a section of fencing near the north pasture when my phone rang. It was Deputy Hernandez. He got straight to the point. "Cole, I figured you'd want to know before you hear it from someone else. Charges are being filed." I leaned against a fence post and looked out across the field. For a second, I didn't say anything. Not because I was shocked, but because the reality of it finally settled in. This thing had started with people complaining about grass. Now it had crossed into criminal court. Over the following days, the news spread through Silver Creek faster than a wildfire. Residents who had once trusted their board suddenly wanted answers. Community meetings became shouting matches. Social media pages exploded with accusations, rumors, and finger-pointing. Some residents blamed the board for creating the entire disaster. Others blamed me for refusing to simply let things go. A few people somehow managed to blame both sides at the same time. Honestly, I understood that part. When situations get messy enough, everybody starts looking for a villain. What interested me most was how many residents reached out privately. Not publicly, privately. People I had never met before sent messages apologizing for what happened. One retired couple even drove out to the ranch and brought Emily a basket filled with homemade cookies and baby gifts. The husband shook my hand and said, "Most of us had no idea what those board members were doing. That meant more to me than any legal victory ever could." It reminded me that communities aren't defined by their loudest people. Most folks just want to live peacefully and be decent neighbors. Unfortunately, decent neighbors don't usually make headlines. A few weeks later, the legal process finally reached its conclusion. The board president and the treasurer accepted plea agreements. Neither wanted to risk taking the case to trial. Too much evidence, too many witnesses, too much documentation, the damaged fence, the drone footage, the unauthorized entry, the records connecting everything together. When sentencing day arrived, I wasn't interested in celebrating. I wasn't standing outside the courthouse grinning. I wasn't looking for revenge. Emily came with me, and as we sat there quietly listening to the judge speak, I realized something important. Winning doesn't always feel the way people imagine. Sometimes it just feels heavy. The judge handed down the penalties, probation terms, financial consequences, and additional restrictions. When it was over, the two men who once strutted across my property like they owned the place walked out looking very different from the people I first encountered that Sunday morning. Smaller somehow, not physically, just emotionally. Reality had finally caught up with them. Outside the courthouse, one local reporter asked me whether I felt vindicated. I remember thinking about the question for a moment before answering. I would have preferred if none of this happened at all. And that was the truth. If somebody offered me a button that could erase the entire situation and guarantee Emily never ended up in that hospital, I would have pushed it without hesitation. No amount of money changes that. Speaking of money, the new agreement eventually moved forward. Not because anyone was forced into it, but because everyone involved finally understood the value of clear boundaries and mutual respect. The terms protected our property. The compensation reflected the actual costs. Most importantly, every expectation was spelled out in black and white. No assumptions, no shortcuts, no room for anyone to pretend they didn't understand where the lines were. As the months passed, things slowly settled down. The golf course turned green again. The fountains came back. Residents returned to arguing about normal neighborhood problems instead of criminal investigations. Life moved forward. Back at the ranch, the most important chapter of all was still waiting to happen. 2 months later, Emily gave birth to our daughter. I can still remember holding that little girl for the first time. The hospital room felt quiet in a way that's hard to describe. Not silent, peaceful, like the world had finally stopped fighting for a minute. Emily looked exhausted and happy at the same time. I sat there staring at our daughter and realized how close I had come to letting anger take control during the worst parts of the conflict. There were moments when I wanted revenge, moments when I wanted humiliation, moments when I wanted the board to suffer exactly the way they had made us suffer. But time has a funny way of clarifying things. Looking down at that little girl, none of those feelings mattered anymore. What mattered was protecting my family. That's it. Everything else was noise. A few months after the birth, I ran into one of the former board members at a hardware store. Not one of the men who faced charges, but someone who had supported them early on. We ended up standing in the same aisle looking at fencing supplies. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed and said, if we'd just apologized that first day, none of this would have happened. I nodded because he was right. The entire disaster could have been avoided by a simple sentence. We're sorry. We were wrong. Instead, pride got involved. Ego got involved. Power got involved. And once those things enter the room, common sense usually heads for the exit. Today, when I drive past Silver Creek, I don't feel angry anymore. I don't feel victorious either. Mostly I feel grateful. Grateful Emily recovered. Grateful our daughter arrived healthy. Grateful my father taught me the importance of keeping records and understanding the value of what you own. Most of all, grateful that I learned a lesson many people never learn until it's too late. Boundaries matter. Property lines matter. Respect matters. Not because of money. Not because of lawsuits. Because every fence, every gate, every piece of land belongs to someone's life story. When you cross those boundaries without permission, you're not just stepping on a dirt. You're stepping into somebody's home, somebody's memories, somebody's family. And that's a line people should think very carefully before crossing. So now I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far when I cut off the water? Or was it the only language those board members were ever going to understand? Should private property rights always come first? Or should neighbors be expected to compromise no matter what? If you were in my position, would you have handled things differently? Let me know down in the comments, because I read every single one. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or a neighbor who thought the rules didn't apply to them, share your story too. Sometimes the best conversations start where the fence line ends.